Tiny Girl shared her blanket with a freezing cub. Next morning, the whole village cried. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The snow fell in thick, silent sheets over the small village of Pine Hollow. Winter had come early this year, bringing with it bitter winds that howled through the night, and temperatures that made even the bravest villagers hurry from doorstep to doorstep. Inside the smallest cabin at the edge of the village, little Sophie Winters sat by the window, her wide blue eyes watching the snowflakes dance in the fading light. She was just 4 years old, with honey-blonde curls that framed her round face and a heart that seemed too big for her tiny body. "Mama, the snow is getting bigger," Sophie said, her small fingers pressed against the frosted glass. The window was cold beneath her touch, but she didn't pull away. There was something magical about watching the world turn white. Emma Winters looked up from the pot of stew she was stirring on the old wood stove. The cabin smelled of herbs and warmth, a stark contrast to the freezing world outside. "It's turning into a real blizzard, little one. Good thing we're all safe inside tonight." Sophie nodded, but her attention had already drifted back to the window. The forest beyond their cabin was now just a dark smudge against the white landscape. As she peered into the growing darkness, something moved at the edge of the trees. Sophie blinked, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her. But there it was again, a small dark shape stumbling through the deep snow. "Mama!" Sophie called, not taking her eyes off the shape. "There's something out there." Emma wiped her hands on her apron and joined her daughter at the window. "Where, sweetie?" She squinted into the swirling snow. "There." Sophie pointed, her finger leaving a tiny print on the glass. It looked small, like a baby. Emma strained her eyes but shook her head. "I don't see anything, Sophie. It's probably just the wind moving the snow around. Now come help me set the table. Papa will be home soon." Sophie reluctantly left her post by the window, but her thoughts remained fixed on what she had seen. As she placed spoons beside the wooden bowls, she kept glancing back toward the window. The movement had been too real, too desperate to be just snow in the wind. After dinner, while her parents sat by the fire discussing the next day's chores, Sophie sneaked back to the window. The night had grown darker, the snow thicker. She pressed her face close to the glass, her breath creating a small circle of fog. And there it was again, the small shape, now closer to the cabin, moving slowly through the snow. In the dim light from their cabin window, Sophie could make out what looked like a small bear cub, its fur matted with ice, its movements growing weaker with each step. Sophie's heart squeezed in her chest. The poor baby bear looked so cold, so alone. Where was its mama? Why was it out in the terrible storm? Without thinking, Sophie glanced at her parents, still deep in conversation, then slipped to her small bed in the corner of the cabin. She pulled her treasured blanket from beneath her pillow, a soft blue quilt her grandmother had made for her before she was born. Sophie clutched it to her chest for a moment, then made her decision. The cabin door was heavy, and Sophie had to push with all her might to open it just enough to slip outside. The cold hit her like a wall, stealing her breath away. Snow immediately clung to her nightgown and slippers, but Sophie didn't turn back. With her blanket held tight in one hand, she stepped into the night, the door closing softly behind her. The snow reached past her knees in some places, making each step a struggle. The wind whipped at her face, and snowflakes stuck to her eyelashes, but Sophie kept her eyes fixed on the small dark shape that had now collapsed near the edge of their yard. Her teeth chattered as she pushed forward, the distance seeming much greater than it had looked from the window. When she finally reached the cub, Sophie gasped. It was even smaller than she had thought. Probably no older than herself in bear years. Its black fur was crusted with ice, and it was curled into a tight ball, shivering violently. Its eyes, dark and frightened, looked up at Sophie, too exhausted to even be afraid of the human child standing before it. "Hi, baby bear," Sophie whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "You look so cold. Where's your mama?" The cub made a soft whimpering sound that broke Sophie's heart. Without hesitation, she unfolded her precious blanket and carefully draped it over the trembling cub. The blue fabric looked stark against the white snow and the cub's dark fur. "There," Sophie said, kneeling beside the cub despite the freezing snow soaking through her nightgown. "That's better, isn't it?" To her surprise, the cub didn't pull away. Instead, it seemed to relax slightly under the warm covering. Sophie reached out one small hand and gently patted the cub's head through the blanket. Its fur felt rough and frozen beneath her fingers. "You can keep my blanket," she told it. "Grandma made it for me, but you need it more. It's the warmest blanket in the whole world." The wind grew stronger, and Sophie shivered violently. She should go back inside now, she knew. Her parents would be worried if they noticed she was gone. But the cub looked so alone, so scared. How could she leave it out here in the storm? Making a quick decision, Sophie sat down in the snow beside the cub and scooted closer, pulling a corner of the blanket over her own shoulders so they could share. The cub stiffened momentarily, then, as if sensing Sophie's kindness, relaxed against her. "I'll stay with you until your mama comes back," Sophie promised, her words forming little clouds in the freezing air. Nobody should be alone in a storm. The snow continued to fall around them, covering Sophie's slippers and the hem of her nightgown. But beneath the blue blanket, a small pocket of warmth began to grow between the child and the cub. Sophie's shivers gradually lessened as they shared body heat, and the cub's breathing became less labored. "My name is Sophie," she told the cub, her voice soft in the quiet snowfall. "I don't know your name, but that's okay. We can be friends without names." The cub made a gentle grunting sound, almost like a response. Sophie smiled, imagining that the cub was introducing itself too. She began to hum a lullaby her mother often sang to her, the melody barely audible over the wind, but soothing nonetheless. Time passed, though Sophie couldn't tell how much. The snow piled higher around them, creating a small, sheltered space. Her fingers and toes had gone numb, but she didn't care. The cub needed her, and she wouldn't leave it alone. Her eyelids grew heavy as the cold seeped deeper into her bones. Sophie fought to stay awake, but it was getting harder. She leaned against the cub, her head resting lightly against its side. The cub didn't move away. Instead, it seemed to curl closer, as if trying to keep her warm too. "Just a little rest," Sophie whispered, her words slurring slightly. "Then I'll go home." As snowflakes continued to dance around them, Sophie drifted into sleep. Her small body curled protectively around the bear cub, both of them covered by the blue blanket that was now dusted with white. In the heart of the blizzard, an unlikely friendship had been formed, a bond of compassion that would soon change everything in the little village of Pine Hollow. Inside the warm cabin, Emma Winters suddenly looked up from her knitting with a start. Something didn't feel right. The cabin seemed too quiet, too still. She glanced toward Sophie's corner, expecting to see her daughter's small form tucked under the covers. "Thomas," she said, her voice tight with sudden worry. "Where's Sophie?" Thomas Winters lowered the book he was reading and frowned. "Isn't she in bed? She was tired after dinner." Emma was already on her feet, crossing to the small bed in the corner. The covers were pulled back, and the pillow was empty. No Sophie, and no blue blanket. "She's not here," Emma said, panic rising in her throat. And her blanket's gone, too. Thomas stood quickly, his face paling. Maybe she's just in the washroom? But a quick search of their small cabin confirmed their worst fears. Sophie was nowhere to be found. It was then that Emma noticed the thin strip of snow on the floor by the door, already melting into a puddle. "The door!" she gasped. "Thomas, she's gone outside." Thomas didn't waste a moment. He grabbed his heavy coat from the hook and yanked on his boots. "Stay here in case she comes back," he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I'll find her." Emma nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to join the search. She lit a lantern and placed it in the window, a beacon to guide her husband and daughter home through the blizzard. Thomas stepped out into the storm, the wind nearly knocking him back against the cabin. Snow pelted his face as he cupped his hands around his mouth. "Sophie!" he shouted, his voice swallowed by the howling wind. "Sophie, where are you?" He trudged through the deep snow, following the barely visible indentations that might have been Sophie's footprints before the fresh snow could fill them in. His heart pounded with fear. How long had she been out in this cold? A child so small couldn't survive long in these temperatures. "Please, God," he whispered as he pushed forward, the lantern in his hand casting ghostly shadows across the white landscape. "Please, keep her safe." As Thomas moved further from the cabin, the wind seemed to shift slightly, and through a momentary break in the swirling snow, he spotted something. A patch of blue against the white, near the edge of their property. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Sophie's blanket, half buried in snow. "Sophie!" he called again, desperation giving his voice new strength as he plowed through the drifts toward the blue patch. "Sophie, answer me." When he was just a few yards away, the wind shifted again, clearing his view for a moment, and what Thomas saw made him freeze in his tracks. There was Sophie, his tiny daughter, curled up in the snow, and pressed against her was the unmistakable dark shape of a bear cub. Thomas's blood ran cold with a fear deeper than any he'd felt before. Where there was a cub, there would be a mother bear, and few things in nature were more dangerous than a mother bear protecting her young. He scanned the surrounding darkness frantically, expecting at any moment to see the looming shape of an adult bear charging toward him. Yet, as the seconds ticked by and no adult bear appeared, Thomas inched closer, torn between rescuing his daughter and the fear of startling the cub. Sophie and the cub weren't moving. Were they? No, he couldn't allow that thought. "Sophie," he called again, softer now, just a few feet away. To his immense relief, Sophie stirred slightly, a small sigh escaping her lips. She was alive, though clearly deeply asleep, or unconscious from the cold. Thomas knelt in the snow beside them, setting down his lantern. Up close, he could see how Sophie had wrapped her precious blanket around both herself and the cub, how their warmth had created a small hollow in the snow around them. The cub, too, was alive, its small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. With a father's gentleness, Thomas reached out to touch his daughter's face. Her skin was icy cold, her lips tinged with blue. He needed to get her inside immediately. As carefully as he could, he began to slide his arms beneath Sophie, trying not to disturb the cub. But as he lifted Sophie, the blanket shifted, and the cub's eyes fluttered open. Thomas tensed, ready to snatch his daughter and run if the cub showed any sign of aggression. Instead, the small bear made a pitiful whimpering sound, struggling weakly to stand, but collapsing back into the snow. "Papa?" Sophie's voice was faint, her eyes barely opening. "Papa, don't leave the baby bear. It's all alone. Its mama is gone." Thomas hesitated, looking between his daughter's pale face and the trembling cub. The right thing, the sensible thing, would be to take Sophie and hurry back to the cabin, to safety and warmth. The cub was wild. Nature would take its course. But something in Sophie's pleading eyes and the cub's helpless state made Thomas pause. He thought of the stories his own grandfather had told him about the special relationship between the people of Pine Hollow and the forest creatures, stories he'd always dismissed as mere legends. "Please, Papa," Sophie whispered, her small hand clutching weakly at his coat. "We can't leave it." "I promised." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, knowing he might regret what he was about to do. Then, with a deep breath, he gathered both Sophie and the bear cub into his arms, wrapping the snow-crusted blanket around them both. The cub made no protest, too weak and cold to resist, or perhaps somehow understanding that this human meant no harm. "Hold on, little one," Thomas murmured, not sure if he was speaking to his daughter or the cub. "Let's get you both warm." The journey back to the cabin seemed to take an eternity, the wind fighting him every step of the way. Thomas's arms ached with the combined weight, and fear gnawed at him. Fear for Sophie's life, fear of what Emma would say about bringing a wild animal into their home, and fear of what might happen when the cub regained its strength. Finally, the warm glow of the cabin came into view. Thomas could see Emma's silhouette in the window, pacing anxiously. He called out as he approached, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "Emma, I found her! Open the door!" Emma flung the cabin door open, her face a mask of relief that quickly turned to shock as Thomas stepped inside with both Sophie and the bear cub in his arms. "Thomas," she gasped, her eyes widening at the sight of the small black bundle nestled against their daughter. "Is that—" "A bear cub," Thomas confirmed, his voice weary as he gently laid Sophie and the cub down on the rug before the fire. She was trying to keep it warm with her blanket. They were huddled together in the snow. Emma's hands flew to her mouth, torn between reaching for her daughter and backing away from the wild animal now lying on her cabin floor. "But Thomas, it's a bear. We can't—" "Mama," Sophie's weak voice interrupted, her eyes fluttering open as the warmth of the fire began to reach her. "Don't be scared. It's just a baby. Its mama is lost." Emma and Thomas exchanged a look over their daughter's head, a look that held fear, uncertainty, and something else, a reluctant admiration for their daughter's compassion that exceeded her years. "Sophie, you could have died out there," Emma said, kneeling beside her daughter and brushing snow from her curls. "What were you thinking, going out in the storm?" Sophie's gaze drifted to the cub, which was beginning to stir as the heat from the fire thawed its frozen limbs. "It was crying, Mama, like when I cry and you come to help me, but its mama didn't come. I had to help." The simple purity of Sophie's explanation struck both parents silent. Thomas removed his snow-covered coat and boots, then retrieved extra blankets from the trunk at the foot of their bed. He wrapped Sophie in a dry, warm blanket, then, after a moment's hesitation, gently dried the bear cub with another. "Thomas, what are we doing?" Emma whispered, watching her husband tend to the wild animal as if it were another child. "We can't keep a bear in our home." "Just until the storm passes," Thomas replied, though uncertainty laced his voice. "We'll decide what to do in the morning. For now, they both need warmth and rest." The cub, now more alert as its body temperature rose, looked around the cabin with wary eyes. It was small, probably born late in the season. Its black fur now revealed to be soft and fluffy as it dried. When its gaze met Sophie's, something remarkable happened. It made a soft chuffing sound and crawled closer to her. "See, Mama?" Sophie said, a weak smile forming on her blue-tinged lips. "It knows we're friends." Emma wasn't convinced, but she could see that her daughter needed immediate care. "Let me get you out of these wet clothes before you catch your death," she said, carefully lifting Sophie away from the cub and carrying her to the bed. As Emma changed Sophie into dry night clothes and wrapped her in warming blankets, she kept a nervous eye on the bear cub. To her surprise, rather than exploring the cabin or showing signs of fear or aggression, the cub stayed right where Sophie had been, its dark eyes fixed on the child as if unwilling to let her out of its sight. Thomas stoked the fire higher, then prepared a warm drink of honey and herbs for Sophie. The storm continued to rage outside their windows, but inside the cabin, an unusual calm had settled. A family and a wild creature sharing the same space, connected by one small girl's act of compassion. "What should we call it, Papa?" Sophie asked as she sipped her warm drink, her color slowly returning. She was propped up in bed now, with a clear view of the cub by the fire. Thomas glanced at his wife, whose expression clearly said this was not a pet to be named. But before he could respond, a new sound cut through the howling of the wind. A deep, rumbling growl from somewhere outside the cabin. Emma froze, the cup in her hand nearly slipping from her grasp. Thomas moved quickly to the window, peering out into the darkness. The lantern light reflected off the swirling snow, making it difficult to see anything clearly, but he didn't need to see to know what was out there. "The mother bear," he said, his voice hushed with dread. "She's come for her cub." The growl came again, louder this time, and with it the sound of heavy paws trudging through snow. Thomas stepped back from the window, his mind racing. If the mother bear sensed her cub was inside their cabin, would she try to break in? Would she attack them to get to her baby? "What do we do?" Emma whispered, instinctively moving to stand between Sophie's bed and the door. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his eyes darting between the door, the windows, and the cub, which had risen to its feet at the sound of its mother's call. "We have to return the cub," he said finally. "It's our only choice." "But Papa, it's so cold outside," Sophie protested, trying to climb out of bed. "And the baby bear was lost. What if they get lost again?" Thomas gently pushed his daughter back against her pillows. "The mother knows how to protect her cubs, Sophie. They belong together, just like you belong with us." The mother bear's growls grew more insistent, and now they could hear scratching at the outer walls of the cabin. The cub responded with excited little yips, pacing near the door. Emma's face was pale with fear, but she nodded at her husband's plan. "Be careful, Thomas," she said as he pulled his coat back on. "Bears are unpredictable, especially mothers protecting their young." Thomas nodded grimly. He found a piece of raw meat left from their dinner and held it in one hand. With the other, he carefully picked up the bear cub, which squirmed in his grasp but didn't fight him. It was still weak from its ordeal in the storm, its movements lacking their natural strength. "Stay back from the windows," he instructed Emma, "and keep Sophie in bed." With a deep breath to steady himself, Thomas unlatched the door and pushed it open with his foot. The wind and snow immediately swept into the cabin, nearly extinguishing the fire. Through the swirling white, Thomas could make out a large, dark shape just yards from their porch. The mother bear, reared up on her hind legs, her massive form silhouetted against the night. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he slowly stepped outside, the cub held securely in his arms. The mother bear dropped to all fours, a threatening growl rumbling from her throat. Her eyes, catching the light from the cabin, glowed with a fierce protectiveness that Thomas recognized all too well. It was the same feeling that had driven him out into the blizzard to find Sophie. "Easy now," Thomas said softly, though he knew the bear couldn't understand his words. It was his tone he hoped would convey that he meant no harm. "I've got your little one. Safe and sound." He took another step forward, then carefully knelt in the snow, placing the cub down. He slid the piece of meat toward it, then backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the mother bear. The cub hesitated, looking back at the warm cabin, then at its mother. For a heart-stopping moment, Thomas feared the cub might try to return to the cabin, to Sophie. But then the mother bear made a soft huffing sound, and the cub scampered toward her, its strength seemingly renewed by the sight of its parent. Thomas watched as the cub nuzzled against its mother, who immediately began checking it over, sniffing and gently nudging it with her nose. The reunion was touching, even in its wildness, and Thomas found himself thinking of how he had held Sophie minutes earlier, checking her for injuries, reassuring himself she was safe. To his surprise, the mother bear looked up from her cub and met his gaze. For a long moment, man and bear regarded each other across the snowy yard. There was something in those dark eyes, an intelligence and understanding, that made Thomas's breath catch. Then the mother bear gently nudged her cub, and together they turned and lumbered toward the forest, soon disappearing into the swirling snow. Thomas stood watching until they were completely out of sight, feeling as though something significant had just occurred, though he couldn't quite put it into words. Finally, the bitter cold drove him back inside, where Emma and Sophie were waiting anxiously. "They're gone," he said as he closed the door firmly against the storm, the mother and her cub heading back to the forest. "Is the baby bear going to be okay?" Sophie asked, her voice small and worried. Thomas smiled as he hung up his coat. "I think so, little one." Its mother looked very strong and very happy to have her baby back. "Like you and Mama were happy to have me back?" Sophie asked. Thomas crossed to his daughter's bed and kissed her forehead, which was warmer now, the dangerous chill receding. "Just like that. Now you should rest. You've had quite an adventure tonight." Sophie yawned, the excitement and cold having drained her small body of energy. "The baby bear was so soft, Papa," she murmured as her eyes began to close. "And it wasn't scared of me. It knew I was trying to help." "You have a kind heart, Sophie," Emma said, tucking the blankets around her daughter. "But please promise us you won't go out in a storm again, not for any reason. You must come to us first." "I promise, Mama," Sophie whispered, already drifting toward sleep. "But I'm glad I helped the baby bear. It needed someone to care." As Sophie fell asleep, Thomas and Emma retreated to the fire, speaking in hushed tones about the night's extraordinary events. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind's howl softening to a gentle moan. Neither of them noticed the set of large paw prints that circled their cabin once before heading back into the forest, nor the smaller tracks that walked alongside them. A mother and cub, together again thanks to the compassion of a tiny girl with a blue blanket. In the dark hours before dawn, while Sophie slept soundly and her parents finally dozed in chairs by the fire, the storm passed. A strange silence fell over Pine Hollow as the first weak rays of morning sun glinted off the pristine blanket of snow that covered the village. It was the kind of silence that comes after something momentous has occurred, though most of the villagers had slept through the night unaware of the drama that had unfolded at the Winters cabin. Miles away, deep in the forest, the mother bear and her cub found shelter in a hollow beneath a fallen oak. The cub, tired but safe, curled against its mother's warm fur. Around its small body was wrapped a soft blue blanket, a gift from a human child that the mother bear, in her wisdom, had chosen not to remove. The scent of the girl clung to the fabric, but it was not a threatening smell. It was the scent of kindness, of protection freely given. As the forest creatures settled into their shelter, the blue blanket became a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of compassion that transcended the natural boundaries between wild and tame, animal and human. And in the winter's cabin, as the new day dawned, no one yet realized that the events of that snowy night would soon ripple through the village, changing hearts and minds in ways no one could have predicted. For shared warmth has a way of spreading, like fire catching from one log to another, until a whole forest is aglow. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows of the winter's cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Thomas was the first to wake, his neck stiff from sleeping in the chair. He rubbed his eyes and glanced over at Sophie's bed. She was still sleeping soundly, her cheeks now rosy with healthy color rather than the frightening pallor of the night before. Emma stirred in the chair opposite him, her eyes fluttering open. "Is it morning already?" she murmured, stretching her arms above her head. Thomas nodded, rising to stoke the dying embers in the fireplace. "The storm's passed. Looks like a clear day." Emma moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to look out at the transformed world. Snow lay thick on the ground, pristine and untouched except for a set of tracks leading from their porch to the forest edge. Large, distinct paw prints. "Thomas," she called softly, "come look at this." He joined her at the window, his breath catching when he saw the tracks. "The mother bear," he confirmed. "But look, there's something else." Beside the larger prints were smaller ones, the cub's tracks, but something was odd about them. The snow around the smaller prints was disturbed in a peculiar way, as if something had been dragging alongside the cub. Sophie's blanket, Emma realized. The bear cub took Sophie's blanket with it. Thomas frowned, unsure whether to be concerned or amused. "Well, I suppose the cub needed it more than Sophie does. We can make her another." A soft groan from the bed drew their attention. Sophie was waking up, her blue eyes blinking sleepily in the morning light. "Mama? Papa? Is the baby bear okay?" Thomas crossed to her bedside and sat on the edge of the mattress. "The baby bear is just fine, little one." Its mama came and took it home. Sophie smiled, but then her face fell slightly. "My blanket is gone." "Yes," Emma said, joining them. "It seems the cub took it with him. I hope you don't mind too much." To their surprise, Sophie's smile returned, brighter than before. "That's good. Now the baby bear will always have something warm, even when it's cold outside." The purity of Sophie's response touched both parents deeply. There was no selfishness in her, no regret for her lost treasure, only happiness that her gift continued to serve its purpose. "You have the kindest heart, Sophie Winters," Thomas said, ruffling her curls. "Now, how about some breakfast? You must be hungry after your adventure." As Emma prepared a hearty meal of porridge and preserved berries, a knock sounded at their door. Thomas opened it to find Oliver Reed, their nearest neighbor, standing on the porch with a concerned expression. "Morning, Thomas," Oliver said, stomping snow from his boots. "Just checking that you folks weathered the storm all right. That was a fierce one." "We're fine, Oliver," Thomas replied, stepping back to allow the man inside. "Though we had quite a night of it." Oliver's eyes widened as he entered, immediately spotting Sophie in her bed. "Is the little one sick?" Emma shook her head as she stirred the porridge. "Not sick, but she gave us a terrible fright. She slipped out during the worst of the storm last night." "Good heavens!" Oliver exclaimed, removing his hat. "Whatever for?" Thomas and Emma exchanged a glance, silently debating how much to share. The story seemed fantastical even to them, and they had lived it. Would their neighbor think them mad if they spoke of bear cubs and blankets and midnight reunions? But Sophie, never one for secrets, piped up from her bed. "I was helping a baby bear, Mr. Reed. It was all alone and freezing, so I gave it my blanket." Oliver's bushy eyebrows shot up nearly to his hairline. "A bear cub? Here, by your cabin?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Hard to believe, I know, but it's true. The cub was separated from its mother in the storm. Sophie found it and tried to keep it warm. I found them both half buried in the snow." "And you brought a wild bear into your home?" Oliver asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "We had no choice," Emma explained, bringing bowls of steaming porridge to the table. "Both Sophie and the cub were near frozen. We couldn't save one and leave the other to die." Oliver shook his head, clearly struggling to process this information. "And the mother bear, did she come looking for her cub?" "She did," Thomas confirmed. "Late in the night, I returned the cub to her, and they went back to the forest." "Well, I'll be," Oliver muttered, accepting the bowl of porridge Emma offered him. "That's quite a tale. Wait until Martha hears about this. She's been saying for years that there's something special about this valley, about the way the animals and people live alongside each other." "Special?" Thomas asked, helping Sophie to the table now that she was feeling stronger. Oliver nodded as he spooned porridge into his mouth. "Martha's grandmother used to tell stories about Pine Hollow, said it was built on sacred ground, a place where the barrier between humans and animals is thinner than elsewhere. Most folks dismiss it as old wives' tales, but Martha believes it." Sophie's eyes grew round with wonder. "Does that mean the baby bear and I are special friends now?" Oliver chuckled. "Who knows, little one? Strange things happen in these mountains." After breakfast, Oliver took his leave, promising to send Martha over later with some fresh-baked bread. As soon as the door closed behind him, Emma turned to Thomas with a worried expression. "You know he's going to tell everyone in the village about this, don't you?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yes, I suppose he will, but it's not as if we did anything wrong. And maybe it's best if people know there's a mother bear in the area. They can be more cautious." "I'm not worried about that," Emma said, lowering her voice so Sophie wouldn't hear as she played with her wooden toys by the fire. "I'm worried about how people will react to Sophie going out in the storm, to us bringing a wild animal into our home. You know how some of the villagers are, always quick to judge, to cry, foolishness or worse." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "Let them talk if they want to. What matters is that Sophie is safe, and we did what was right in the moment. I won't apologize for that, and neither should you." Emma squeezed his hand gratefully, but the worry didn't leave her eyes. In a small village like Pine Hollow, gossip spread faster than wildfire, and could be just as destructive. By midday, Oliver's wife Martha arrived as promised, bearing not only fresh bread, but also a pot of her famous venison stew, and 3 other village women in tow. Elizabeth Carter, Sarah Thompson, and Margaret Miller all crowded into the small cabin, their eyes immediately finding Sophie, who was now feeling well enough to sit by the window, watching the forest. "Oh, you poor dear," Elizabeth exclaimed, rushing to Sophie's side and feeling her forehead. "Oliver told us everything. How brave you were, but how dangerous. You could have frozen to death out there." "Or been eaten by that bear," Sarah added, her tone disapproving as she glanced at Thomas and Emma. "I can't believe you let her near a wild animal." "We didn't let her do anything," Emma said defensively. "She slipped out while we weren't looking, and by the time Thomas found her, she and the cub were already together." "Well, I think it's remarkable," Martha said, her kind eyes twinkling as she set the bread on the table. Not many grown men would approach a bear cub, let alone a child. Sophie must have a special gift. Margaret, the village healer, knelt beside Sophie and examined her hands and feet. "No signs of frostbite," she pronounced. "A miracle, considering how long you were out in that storm. You must have had an angel watching over you, child." "Not an angel," Sophie said seriously. "A bear. The baby bear kept me warm, too." The women exchanged glances, some skeptical, some wondering. Elizabeth cleared her throat. "Well, the important thing is that you're safe now. But promise us you won't go wandering off again, especially not in winter." Sophie nodded solemnly. "I promise. But I don't regret helping the baby bear. It needed me." There was something in Sophie's simple statement that silenced the room. Even Sarah, who had been about to launch into a lecture on the dangers of wild animals, closed her mouth and looked thoughtful. "Out of the mouths of babes," Martha murmured, her eyes misting. "Sometimes I think children understand more about kindness than we adults do." As the women busied themselves setting out the stew and bread for lunch, Thomas pulled on his coat. "I'm going to check our woodpile, make sure we have enough for the next few days," he told Emma. "The snow's deep, but I should be able to clear a path." Outside, the cold air bit at Thomas's face, but the day was bright and clear, the storm nothing but a memory. He was shoveling a path to the woodshed when he heard someone calling his name. Turning, he saw Benjamin Harris, the village mayor, trudging through the snow toward him, followed by several other men from the village. "Thomas," Benjamin called, waving. "We came as soon as we heard. Is everyone all right?" Thomas leaned on his shovel, nodding. "We're fine, Benjamin. Just a bit of excitement last night." The mayor and his companions reached the cleared portion of the yard, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. "Oliver tells us your Sophie befriended a bear cub in the middle of the blizzard," Benjamin said, his tone making it clear he wasn't sure whether to believe the story. "It's true," Thomas confirmed, resuming his shoveling to hide his discomfort at being the center of attention. "Found them both half buried in the snow, sharing Sophie's blanket." "And you brought the beast into your home?" Isaac Wilson, the village blacksmith, asked incredulously. "What would you have had me do, Isaac?" Thomas responded, a edge entering his voice. "Leave it to die? It was a baby animal, no bigger than a large dog, and my daughter was determined to protect it." "Still," muttered Frederick Daniels, who raised sheep on the south side of the village, "bears are dangerous, even the young ones. And where there's a cub, there's a mother." "Yes, there is," Thomas agreed. "She came looking for her cub in the night. I returned it to her, and they left together, no harm done to anyone." Benjamin scratched his beard thoughtfully. "It's an unusual tale, Thomas. Some might even call it a miracle. A child and a bear cub keeping each other alive through the worst storm we've had in years." Thomas straightened, meeting the mayor's eyes. "I don't know about miracles, Benjamin. All I know is my daughter has a heart bigger than most grown folk. She saw a creature in need and didn't think twice about helping it, even at risk to herself. If there's a lesson in all this, maybe that's it." The men fell silent, considering his words. Then Benjamin nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right. In times like these, with the winter so harsh and supplies running low, we could all stand to be a bit more like little Sophie." Frederick still looked skeptical. "Well, I'm just glad the mother bear took her cub and left. Let's hope they stay deep in the forest where they belong." As the men continued discussing the encounter, debating its meaning and implications for the village, none of them noticed the small face watching from the cabin window. Sophie, her eyes bright with curiosity, had been listening to every word. And as she watched her father defend her actions, A warm feeling of pride spread through her chest. But Sophie's attention was soon drawn away from the men's conversation. Something at the edge of the forest caught her eye. A flash of movement, a dark shape against the white snow. She pressed her face closer to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. There, just where the trees began, stood the mother bear. She was partially hidden by a large pine, but her shape was unmistakable, and beside her, barely visible, was the cub. For a long moment Sophie stared at the bears, and though she couldn't be sure at that distance, she thought the mother bear was looking directly at the cabin, at her. "Mama," Sophie called, not taking her eyes off the forest edge. "Mama, they're back." Emma hurried to the window, the village women crowding behind her. "What's back, sweetheart?" "The bears. Look, at the edge of the trees." All eyes turned to where Sophie was pointing, but the forest line was empty now, just swaying pines and pristine snow. "I don't see anything, dear," Martha said gently. "They were there," Sophie insisted. "The mama bear and her baby. They were watching us." Elizabeth exchanged a meaningful look with Sarah. "The child's been through a lot," she whispered. "Perhaps she's still seeing things." But Emma, looking at her daughter's earnest face, wasn't so sure. "Maybe they were checking on you," she suggested, stroking Sophie's curls, "making sure you were safe, just as you made sure the cub was safe." Sophie beamed at her mother's understanding. "Yes, that's exactly what they were doing." Outside, Thomas and the village men were still deep in conversation when a shout from the forest edge caught their attention. It was Jonathan Turner, one of the village hunters, running toward them through the snow, his face alight with excitement. "Thomas! Benjamin!" he called as he approached. "You won't believe what I just saw." The men turned to him, curious. Jonathan was known for his steady nerves and reliable reports. He wasn't one for exaggeration or fancy. "What is it, Jonathan?" Benjamin asked. The hunter was breathing hard from his run through the deep snow. "Bears," he panted. "A mother and cub at the forest edge, but that's not the strange part. The cub had something with it, something blue. It looked like a blanket." A murmur ran through the gathered men. Thomas stepped forward. "A blue blanket? You're sure?" Jonathan nodded emphatically. "As sure as I'm standing here. The cub was dragging it through the snow, like a child with a comfort toy. Never seen anything like it in all my years of hunting." "Sophie's blanket," Thomas said softly. "The one she wrapped around the cub last night." Benjamin's eyes widened. "Sophie's blanket? The bears kept it." "Seems so," Jonathan confirmed. "Never seen anything like it in all my born days." Thomas stood silent for a moment, processing this new information. The mother bear hadn't just taken her cub back. She had allowed it to keep Sophie's blanket, a human object that should have been foreign and suspicious to a wild animal. It was as if the bear understood the kindness behind the gift. "We should tell the others," Benjamin decided, his authoritative voice cutting through the men's murmured discussions. "Tonight, at the meeting hall, a story like this, everyone should hear it." Thomas nodded his agreement, though his mind was already elsewhere, on his daughter and the extraordinary bond she had formed with a creature of the wild. As the men dispersed, their boots crunching through the fresh snow, Thomas returned to his cabin with a new sense of wonder about the world and his daughter's place in it. Inside, the cabin buzzed with the energy of visitors and conversation. Sophie, seeming fully recovered from her ordeal, was regaling the village women with every detail of her encounter with the bear cub, how soft its fur had felt, how it had snuggled against her for warmth, how its eyes had seemed to thank her. "And I told it that Grandma made the blanket special for me," Sophie was saying, her small hands gesturing animatedly, but that it needed it more than I did because it lives outside all the time. The women listened, captivated by the child's tale and the innocent wisdom in her words. Even Sarah, who had been the most critical of Sophie's adventure, seemed moved by the pure compassion that radiated from the little girl. When Thomas shared Jonathan's sighting, confirming that the cub still had Sophie's blanket, a hush fell over the cabin. It was Martha who finally broke the silence. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "my grandmother used to tell a story about this valley. She said that long ago, when the first settlers came here, they arrived in the dead of winter with little food and no shelter. They would have perished in the cold if not for a family of bears that abandoned their den, leaving it fully stocked with honey and dried berries. The settlers survived because of that unexpected kindness, and they named this place Pine Hollow, in honor of the pine-lined den that saved them." "That's just a legend," Sarah objected, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Martha conceded with a small smile, "but every legend has its root in truth. And now here we are, generations later, witnessing another act of connection between human and bear." As afternoon turned to evening, word of Sophie's encounter with the bear cub and Jonathan's sighting spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire. By nightfall, when Benjamin called the village meeting, the community hall was packed with every resident, all eager to hear the full tale directly from the Winters family. Thomas, Emma, and Sophie sat at the front of the hall, somewhat uncomfortable with being the center of attention but understanding the importance of what they had experienced. Sophie, dressed in her best clothes with her honey-blonde curls neatly combed, looked impossibly small on the large wooden chair, her feet dangling well above the floor. Benjamin called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "we've gathered tonight to hear an extraordinary tale, one that I believe holds a lesson for us all during these harsh winter months." He gestured for Thomas to speak, and with some reluctance, Thomas rose to his feet. Public speaking had never been his strength, but he recounted the events of the previous night as clearly and honestly as he could. Sophie's disappearance, his frantic search, finding her and the cub huddled together in the snow, bringing them both to safety, and finally, returning the cub to its mother under the cover of darkness. When he mentioned how the mother bear had looked him in the eye, seeming to communicate a silent understanding, a murmur ran through the crowd. And when Jonathan stood to confirm his sighting of the cub with Sophie's blue blanket, the murmur grew to an excited buzz. "May we hear from Sophie?" Martha called from her seat. After all, she's the heart of this story. All eyes turned to the tiny girl, who suddenly seemed shy under the attention of so many adults. Emma gave her daughter an encouraging nod, and Sophie slid off her chair and stepped forward. "I just did what anyone would do," she said, her voice small but clear in the hushed hall. The baby bear was cold and scared and alone. I had a warm blanket. It wasn't a hard choice. The simplicity of her explanation brought tears to many eyes in the room. In a child's innocent logic, the solution had been obvious. A creature in need deserved help, regardless of what kind of creature it was. "But weren't you afraid?" Frederick asked from the back of the hall. "Bears are dangerous, even young ones." Sophie considered the question seriously before responding. "No," she said finally. "It wasn't scary. The baby bear was just like me, small and needing to be warm. We helped each other." A thoughtful silence fell over the hall as the villagers absorbed Sophie's words. Then Martha stood, her face glowing with an inner light. "I believe we're witnessing something profound here," she said. My grandmother spoke of the special connection between this valley and its creatures. She said that acts of kindness between humans and animals would be repaid tenfold, that such bonds would protect our village through the harshest times. Frederick scoffed, though gently. Martha, you know I respect you, but those are just old stories. Are they? Martha challenged. Then how do you explain a wild bear allowing its cub to keep a human blanket? How do you explain a child and a cub surviving a blizzard that would have killed either one alone? Sometimes, Frederick, the old stories contain the deepest truths. Before Frederick could respond, the hall door banged open, letting in a blast of cold air and a snow-covered Jonathan Turner. His eyes were wide with excitement or fear. It was hard to tell which. "Come quickly," he gasped. "All of you. At the village square. You have to see." The meeting dissolved into confused chatter as everyone rose and began filing out of the hall. Thomas lifted Sophie into his arms, wrapping her in his coat against the evening chill, as they joined the procession moving toward the village square. The night was clear and cold, stars pricking the velvet sky like countless diamonds. The full moon cast an ethereal glow over the snow-covered village, turning everything to silver. As they approached the square, Thomas heard gasps from those ahead of him, saw people pointing and clutching at each other in disbelief. When they reached the edge of the square, Thomas stopped dead in his tracks, his arms tightening protectively around Sophie. Emma gripped his arm, her fingernails digging into his sleeve. In the center of the village square, illuminated by moonlight, stood the mother bear. She was magnificent in her wild power, her dark fur gleaming, her breath forming clouds in the frosty air. Beside her was the cub, and draped across its back, unmistakable even in the silvery light, was Sophie's blue blanket. The villagers formed a wide circle around the bears, no one daring to move closer or to flee. The mother bear seemed unconcerned by their presence, her calm gaze sweeping over the gathered humans until it found what she was seeking. "Sophie." "Papa," Sophie whispered, wriggling in Thomas's arms. "She's looking for me. Put me down." "Sophie, no," Emma protested, reaching for her daughter. "It's not safe." But there was something in the mother bear's stance, not threatening, not aggressive, that made Thomas hesitate. The bear could have charged, could have roared, or displayed her impressive claws. Instead, she waited, as if for permission to approach. "Wait," Benjamin said softly, moving to Thomas's side. "Let's see what happens. Everyone stay still." Heart pounding, Thomas slowly lowered Sophie to the ground but kept his hands on her shoulders. The mother bear watched, her dark eyes intelligent and assessing. Then, with deliberate slowness, she nudged her cub forward. The cub took a few tentative steps toward Sophie, the blue blanket trailing in the snow behind it. The village held its collective breath. Children were shushed, dogs held firmly by their collars. The normal sounds of the night, the creak of branches, the distant hoot of an owl, seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Sophie, showing no fear, stepped forward to meet the cub, moving just beyond her father's reach before he could stop her. The two small figures, human child and bear cub, stood facing each other in the moonlight, a tableau that none who witnessed it would ever forget. The cub made a soft chuffing sound, then did something that drew gasps from every throat. It shrugged the blue blanket from its back and pushed it forward with its nose, offering it back to Sophie. "Oh," Sophie breathed, kneeling in the snow. "Are you returning my blanket? But don't you need it to stay warm?" As if understanding her words, the cub nudged the blanket closer, then turned and trotted back to its mother. But instead of leaving, the mother bear settled onto her haunches, watching, waiting. Puzzled, Sophie picked up her blanket. It was soggy from the snow and smelled strongly of bear, but otherwise undamaged. As she held it up, something fell from its folds into the snow, something small and gleaming. Thomas stepped forward cautiously, bending to see what had fallen from the blanket. It was a perfect, intact pine cone, unlike any he had seen before. Its scales were edged with what looked like gold, catching the moonlight and throwing back tiny sparks of fire. "What is it, Papa?" Sophie asked, still clutching her reclaimed blanket. Before Thomas could answer, Martha pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes fixed on the golden pine cone. "Oh my," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Oh my goodness." "What is it, Martha?" Benjamin asked. "Do you know what this means?" Martha nodded, tears streaming freely down her lined face. "The legend of the golden pine," she said, "my grandmother's most precious story. She said that once every 100 years, the guardian bears of these woods choose a human worthy of receiving the golden pine cone. It's a symbol of protection, of blessing upon the entire village." Frederick stepped forward, his earlier skepticism replaced by wonder. "And the last time? When was the golden pine cone last given?" "To my grandmother's grandmother," Martha replied. "The winter of the Great Famine, when the village nearly starved. After receiving the pine cone, the hunting improved, the spring came early, and no one in Pine Hollow went hungry again for many years." All eyes turned back to the mother bear and her cub. The massive creature rose to her full height, towering over the snowy square. She made a sound, not a growl, but something softer, almost like a purr, then turned, nudging her cub ahead of her. Together they padded across the square and disappeared into the trees, leaving only their tracks in the pristine snow. For a long moment no one spoke. The night seemed to hold its breath around them. Then Sophie, still kneeling in the snow with her returned blanket, reached for the golden pine cone. As her small fingers closed around it, a strange, warm light seemed to pulse from within it, illuminating her face from below. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and it feels alive." Benjamin stepped forward, addressing the assembled villagers who still stood in stunned silence. "Friends," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I believe we have witnessed something miraculous tonight. A bond formed between a child and a creature of the wild, a bond that may bring blessing to us all." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even Frederick, the eternal skeptic, looked moved beyond words. "Sophie Winters," Benjamin continued, kneeling before the little girl, "you acted with pure compassion, risking yourself to save another. The bears have recognized what we too often forget, that kindness transcends all boundaries, even those between species. You have brought honor to Pine Hollow." Sophie blushed, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what was right," she said simply. "And that," Martha said, her eyes shining, "is the most powerful magic of all." In the days that followed, news of the golden pine cone spread throughout the region. Visitors came from neighboring villages to see it, to hear the tale of the tiny girl who had shared her blanket with a freezing cub. The pine cone was placed in a special box carved by the village woodworker and displayed in the meeting hall, a reminder to all of Sophie's compassion and the mysterious bond between the human and animal worlds. As Martha had predicted, blessings seemed to flow to Pine Hollow. The remainder of the winter was milder than anyone could remember. Game was plentiful, keeping the village well fed until spring. When the snow finally melted, the wildflowers that bloomed were more vibrant than ever before, and the village gardens yielded harvests of extraordinary abundance. But the greatest change was in the villagers themselves. The story of Sophie and the bear cub had opened something in their hearts, a renewed sense of connection to each other and to the natural world around them. Acts of kindness became more frequent. A helping hand here, a shared meal there, a genuine concern for the welfare of all. And Sophie? She grew taller and stronger with each passing season, but she never lost the compassion that had led her into the blizzard that fateful night. On her bed now lay a new blue blanket, crafted by Emma with even more love than the first. The old blanket, washed but still bearing the faint scent of bear, was framed and hung on the cabin wall, a reminder of the night that changed everything. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun was setting behind the mountains, Sophie would slip away to the edge of the forest. There, in a small clearing visible only to those who knew where to look, she would leave little gifts, a handful of berries, a sprig of sweet herbs, or simply a flower in bloom. And though she never saw them directly, fresh bear tracks would often appear overnight near her offerings, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that remained. Years passed, and Sophie grew from a tiny girl to a wise young woman, known throughout the region for her special way with animals. The golden pine cone continued to shine, never dulling or aging, and Pine Hollow thrived as it never had before, its people living in harmony with each other and with the creatures of the forest. On the 10th anniversary of that snowy night, the village held a special celebration. Tables laden with food filled the square, music played, and children danced beneath pine boughs strung with lanterns. At the height of the festivities, Benjamin, now white-haired but still strong, called for silence. "A decade ago," he announced, his voice carrying across the square, "a child's act of kindness brought blessing to our village. Tonight, we honor that kindness and the lessons it taught us." Sophie, now 14 and tall for her age, blushed as all eyes turned to her. She stood gracefully, her honey-blonde curls now falling in waves down her back, the golden pine cone hanging from a chain around her neck where she always kept it. "The blessing wasn't mine to give," she said, her voice clear and confident. "It came from understanding that every creature deserves compassion, that boundaries between us are often of our own making. The bear cub needed warmth. I had a blanket. It was as simple as that." As if summoned by her words, a hush fell over the gathering. On the far side of the square, at the very edge of the torchlight, stood a massive black bear, larger than any had seen before, its fur gleaming like polished onyx. Beside it was a younger bear, nearly full-grown but with eyes that somehow seemed familiar. No one ran, no one screamed. Instead, a reverent silence descended as every villager recognized the significance of the moment. The mother bear and her cub, now grown, had returned, drawn perhaps by some memory of kindness or by the celebration that honored their part in the village's story. Sophie stepped forward, away from the tables and the crowd, her hand instinctively rising to touch the golden pine cone at her throat. The larger bear watched her approach, its eyes reflecting the torchlight like twin flames. Then, with deliberate dignity, it raised a massive paw and placed it on the ground, as if in greeting or acknowledgement. Sophie mirrored the gesture, placing her hand flat against the earth. Though they stood yards apart, something invisible seemed to pass between them. A current of understanding, a reaffirmation of the bond formed years ago in the heart of a blizzard. For one breathtaking moment, the bears and the humans regarded each other across the square, two worlds meeting in mutual respect. Then, with a soft huff that might almost have been a farewell, the bears turned and melted back into the darkness of the forest. As the villagers erupted into excited whispers, Thomas wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "You know," he said quietly, "some might say it was just coincidence that they appeared tonight." Sophie smiled up at her father, her eyes wise beyond her years. "And some might say that kindness creates connections that last a lifetime, even across different worlds." Thomas nodded, his throat tight with emotion as he looked at the strong, compassionate young woman his tiny girl had become. "Your mother and I could not be prouder of the heart you carry, Sophie." As the celebration resumed around them, Sophie cast one last glance toward the forest. The bears were gone, but their presence lingered, a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles begin with the smallest acts of compassion. A tiny girl had shared her blanket with a freezing cub, and in doing so had woven a tapestry of kindness that would warm the village of Pine Hollow for generations to come. And in the heart of the forest, beneath the starlit sky, a mother bear and her grown cub settled into their den, where a faded scrap of blue fabric still lined one corner. A cherished reminder of the night when boundaries dissolved, and two different kinds of love found common ground in the simple act of sharing warmth.